More than 7 years after the murdering of Muammar Gaddafi, Libya is at the brink of a new conflict. To say this in other words, Libya continues in a conflict, under violence since the invasion of NATO in 2011. There is no peace or democracy. There is no well-being for the population. With the recent facts, two forces face for the control of Tripoli, and this was once the capital of Libya. ONU, or the United Nations, request humanitarian channels to allow civilians to escape, while other powers face their interests for their own goods. Today, in Critical moves the dispute for Libya. Let's start. So let us start with the first move. There are two forces facing each other in Tripoli, one from the west and the other one from the support of certain Arab countries. And I will tell the Security Council that the localized aspect of this conflict during the last 15 days should not be soothing. There is a possibility of a generalized conflagration. They should be more active and united in order to hold a conflagration as general as this. These international divisions have encouraged the attack, and these divisions of today are for me a source of suffering as big as the fight on site. About the legislators, everything's happening can be considered a war crime. Everyone in charge of these crimes should be taken by the armed forces to the International Legal Court. Some of them are divided into two, and the images of the site are terrifying. The rockets are thrown indiscriminately, and they hit innocent people. And Ausal is at the center of the capital. It's one of the most densely zoned population. Tripoli has a population of 2.5 million people. Now, about this statement, let's go to Libya, a very important country, and let's set the historical context of this nation. Libya is a country in the north of Africa. Its capital is Tripoli. Currently, its population is over 6 million people. Its borders are with the Mediterranean Sea, Egypt, Sudan, Chad, and Nigeria, as well as Algeria and Tunisia. Most of their people are Berber and Arabian. Islam is the official religion and the language is Arabian. They also speak Berber and also English and Italian for trade. Libya was an Italian colony in 1912 through the Osana Treaty, and under the bylaws of Libya, its territory was widened through French concessions. Regardless of the oppositions in the south, which movement of the opposition became the awareness of the future state of Libya, the country was controlled by Italy until the end of World War II, when occupied by the Allies. Some provinces were under control of the English, the French, and the Americans. In 1947, Italy no longer had a colonial position after bloody conflict. The United Nations agreed on the independence of Libya in 1949, which became effective in 1952. Idris I was the king until 1969, where a coup overthrew him. Colonel Gaddafi stated a government called Jamahiriya, which is the mass state. In 2011, the situation of the country was aggravated by a revolt in the city of Benghazi. This crisis was the perfect excuse for the NATO and its allies to invade the country. In 2011, the United States President Great Britain started a military offensive. After these operations, Gaddafi was overthrown and brutally assassinated. Ever since, the African nation that once was the most developed nation of the continent has not reached peace and currently faces conflict. The majority of the migrants coming from sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa go through Libya in their attempt to reach Africa. This has encouraged the transit of migrants to Europe, and it's an ideal place for smuggling. Patrol controls the conflict scene, and it has two advantages: its proximity to Europe and its production of reserves of crude oil and natural gas of the best quality. Different world powers intervene in the war in order to comply with their interests. This is part of the geography, the history, and what Libya means in the geopolitical portal. Now let's take a look at two web portals. The first one, Prensa Latina, about the consequences of the new conflict taking place in Libya. 250 people were killed and over 1,000 are injured in Tripoli since April 4th, date in which the forces of Khalifa Haftar attacked some of the cities. According to information from the WHO, 20,000 people have been displaced due to this, and the United Nations requests a humanitarian truce in order to evacuate civilians that were trapped in this crossfire. Now let's take a look at the RT portal. The offensive of Libya advances to take over Tripoli. It's Russia Today. On the screen, the ENL has started the second stage of its offensive to take over the capital of the country, according to the local media Wassat, by quoting Khalifa Haftar and also Ahmad al-Mismari. The spokesman said that the troops of the infantry of the ENL have concluded the task of the first stage, amongst them clearing territory, identifying the main positions, and secondary of the government of the national agreement known as GAN. According to al-Mismari, the forces of the Mariscal are becoming integrated in unit of secondary battle in this second stage. This starts after the ENL affirmed to take aerial views outside of Tripoli. They control the east and other parts of Libya, which means over 70% of the territory of the country, while the rebel government beyond the capital also have under their control the west of the nation. Now, let's look at more facts, because Libya is the theater of military operations, a situation that requires the analysis of the media and the explanations. This is our recommendation. In Los Tiempos, where Alfredo Jimenez speaks about the conflict in Libya, a country in the verge of a civil war. Among the main militias, they add the ENL of Haftar and also the Council of Shura, the revolutionaries of Benghazi, a complex group of radical combats of Islam, including those who are faithful to the Islamic State. Others are the Brigades of Defense of Benghazi, a new group of fighters that have been expelled for the city and together with the previous ones are enemies of Haftar. In the meantime, to the east, there is a wild group called the Amanecer Libio, or the Libyan Dawn, that controls most of the zone, has been divided into different brigades that are loyal to one or the other government. They are divided by regional, ethnic, and local groups, which fuels up these differences. So now we continue with more information. Let's speak with our correspondent. So first, Hishan with news from Damascus. Hishan. Hello, colleagues and viewers. After the assassination of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, through a military intervention of the NATO that was led by the United States, two groups came to place in Libya. First, one of Haftar in the Tobruk city east of Libya, the strongmen in the country who dominate 2/3 of the Libyan territory. A great part of the border crosses and many of the oil facilities. In the other side, the government of the National Unit in charge of Assad is located in Tripoli. On April 4th, the Libyan crisis reached a new spiral of tension after Haftar ordered an attack against Tripoli in order to, according to him, free it from terrorists. And as retaliation 3 days later, the forces loyal to the government of national unity announced the Volcan operation against the Haftar troops. The battles that continue, that even use aerial bombing and artillery, have so far, according to the nation, killed over 264 people and 1,200 wounded, and over 32,000 people displaced from their homes. The United Nations Fund for Infants, UNICEF, mentions that the new scale of violence in Libya affects around 1.5 million people, amongst them 500,000 children, because the war also led to blackouts, as well as the interruption of water supply and higher prices for food. Currently, the national government and army of Libya controls different districts of the south of the capital, Tripoli, and the troops of the government of national unity had a counterattack against Haftar in order to retrieve the control over these districts. The The United Nations called for humanitarian truce to evacuate the civilians trapped under their crossfire, but their calls are not being heard. Haftar has been supported by the United Arab Emirates and Egypt as well, and it also has support from the West, especially from France, and they consider that taking over the capital by their forces is absolutely necessary in order to end the crisis in the country that has taken place there since 2011. However, the reality is that in this oil nation of North Africa, there are still fights for power, and the military action among the militias fighting each other with the so-called terrorist groups. Well, crime also increases, and people and weapons trafficking. 8 years after the fall of Gaddafi, Libya once again suffers problems with their crisis, encouraged by influence from abroad that in order to defend their energy interests, encourage military clashes on the inside without the need of intervening directly, as they did in 2011. The evidence is that recently Donald Trump expressed in a conversation his support to Mariscal Haftar in his work in his fight against terrorism, the protection of oil resources of Libya, whose reserves are the biggest in Africa, with 48 billion potential barrels of oil, which is one of the biggest ones in the world. Reason enough for many countries to have interest in Libya and to continue with the conflict, not only in Libya, but also in the neighboring countries, Algeria and Sudan, and turn the north of Africa into a political incubator at the service of their interest. This is all the information we have for you right now. Back to studio. Thank you for your information, Hicham. This is part of everything that these events mean in Libya on the inside and internationally as well, as we mentioned at the beginning of the show. We're going to watch this in depth when taking a look at the analysis to see how each one of the actors of the powers are present due to geopolitical reasons in Libya. Now, from Damascus, we go to Washington with our correspondent Jorge Gestoso. Thank you very much. On April 7, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State of the United States, said in a statement that I will read as follows. The United States are extremely concerned about the battles near Tripoli. We've made it clear that we oppose the attack of Khalifa Haftar, and we urge the cease of military operations immediately against the forces of the capital and for them to return to their previous positions. Days after, President Trump leaves behind the statements of the Secretary of State when taking the phone and speaking directly with Haftar, after which the White House issued a statement saying the following. President Trump acknowledges the significant role of Mariscal Khalifa Haftar in his fight against terrorism and to ensure the oil resources of Libya. They both spoke about their shared view of the transition towards a stable political system. So it contradicts the initial position of their states. We need to emphasize that at least 70% of the territory is under the control of Mariscal Haftar, and that's the control of the oil fields as well. This, according to analysts, justifies that President Trump decides to take a 180-degree turn and stop supporting the government in Tripoli, a government established by the United Nations that allegedly had the support of the United States and turns based on their interest of controlling in Libya the oil wells and have control over all the oil and natural resources. Thank you, Jorge. Undoubtedly, this is extremely important. But now, what happens with the oil? Let's take a look at this later on. So this tour now takes us from Washington to Cairo with the Atado, because from the capital, they are going to show us what's the meeting between the African Union members. Indeed, in the meeting of the presidents of Africa in El Cairo, the situation of Sudan has been the main topic for these meetings. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, president, mentioned that Egypt supports free elections, and also to respect the rights and demands of people of Sudan in order to determine the future of the country further on. He also called the international community to support the transition in Sudan and for this political transition to be carried out in a peaceful way and respecting the demands of the people of Sudan. This event is taking place due to a request of the African Union, and as we explained in a previous report, Egypt presides in 2019 the presidency of this regional organization and thus has the responsibility of mediating and facilitating consensus in this type of conflicts. The manager of the Security Service of Sudan is also there, Abu Bakr, and this is a meeting that happens 10 days after the coup d'etat that took place in Sudan against President Omar al-Bashir, after the wave of protests that for months had taken place in the streets of Sudan. Let us remember that now demonstrators in the streets of Sudan demand to establish in the country a civil government instead of a military government, and that likewise would answer to the economic crisis through which the country is going at this moment. In the afternoon, the leaders of Africa will also hold a meeting to discuss the situation in Libya, where violence is worsening since the beginning of April. Both Libya and Sudan are going through processes of destabilization politically and political instability, but also insecurity and uncertainty in their country. These situations could also affect the stability of all the region of Africa and the Middle East. Thank you, Nayara. These are our correspondents in the place of the events, the eyes of Telesur, explaining us in detail what are the things happening in each one of the nations. So now we continue to a break, the first one in critical moves of Telesur, and today's move, the challenge for Libya. So now we're gonna see what this nation owns, not only oil, but what else that makes it so appetizing in this geopolitical table. We will be back. We are back. Beyond the fights and the strategies of the side to take over Libya, we see in the conflict the use of abroad forces. The sides in Libya reinforce their positions for the fight for the control of Tripoli. Muammar Haftar bases his attack in the aeroplane that has not been used for 5 years as the main pillar in his will to take over before the Ramadan starts, and using this point later to continue with the fights to the north of the country. Other units marched in the last hours in Misrata, 200 kilometers away from Tripoli, to enforce the government of the national agreement. In Tobruk, forces stated that this is the second phase of the attack against the capital and that the objective is to strengthen the position in the airport and widen the security in order to use it as a logistical base, as their hub. Now, let's place the context. We wonder the following: damned, doomed, or blessed? There's an interpretation about Libya and its natural resources. The important strategy of Libya is based in two reasons. First is natural riches. It has the biggest reserves of oil in Africa and the fifth highest reserves of natural gas there. Its crude Like the Saudi, it's easier to extract and cheaper to refine. That's why there is importance on Libya that led to the invasion of 2019. According to the yearly report of British Petroleum for 2018, the reserves of Libya add up to 48 billion potential barrels, being one of the biggest reserves in the world. Imperialist nations needed to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan leader who governed the country during 42 years and whose government made Libya the country with the highest quality of life in Africa. Due to Gaddafi, literacy improved to 83%. The other aspect that makes Libya a country that serves the interests of the main nations is its location near Europe, especially for trade. That's why countries are France and Italy interested, who want to have interest with their own point of view in that country. But being near Europe has brought another problem: the migrations that used Libya as a departing port to the old continent. The route between Libya and Sicily is considered the most dangerous one. In 2017, 3,000 people died trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea. Now, let's continue with our analysis. That's why we have Miguel Jaimes, who's a doctor in material sciences and also works in geopolitics and oil and in geopoliticalpetroleo.com.ve from Venezuela. Professor, how are you? Hi, hello, how are you, Tatiana? Thank you. One of the main topics of this discussion is about oil. Is it so clear from those nationally and internationally, knowing that the core of this dispute is oil? The oil is the key of global conflict, and even more when the Department of the State and Trump's administration have tried to follow a very offensive policy that looks like neo-Nazi against the foreign world. And the main pillar they have attacked and where they have applied more sanctions is when speaking about oil. As we see it in Libya, we can also see it happening in Iraq, and they want to do this the same against Iran, and the same thing can also be seen against Venezuela. Undoubtedly, oil is the conflict, the sign of the new fights for decades in our country. Professor, let's bring in from Panama Jorge Castañeda, a lawyer and political analyst. Jorge, how are you? Hi, how are you? Thank you. The NATO's invasion took place in 2011 with the support of their allies. 8 years have gone by. Why now? In order to try to understand these events, why has the violence aggravated again? We need to set a context about what's happening in Libya and all the Middle East, but also the attempt of the north of the United States to support Israel with their attempt of continuing expanding their empire of terror zionistically. So from our perspective, they are trying to create a great alliance to continue with Libya, with Haftar, who was related with the CIA, but we also know that the north of Africa, it's an important place due to Libya with its natural resources, its oil. Another element that, as always, the imperialists are trying to steal from the peoples is part of their business. But under the context of the re-election of Netanyahu, then the new geopolitical plan that they're going to have, that they have for the Middle East and the United States and their allies. Professor, back to you. Because from the inside and the resources of Libya will be able to understand what happens. Beyond oil and gas, experts also mentioned that both oil and gas are easily accessible technically and industrially, and this becomes more appetizing for transnational oil companies. Indeed, because gas has reunified many countries as Kuwait and Qatar that recently have joined the exporting oil countries. And for some years they're talking about a new oil market that is not based on dollars or euros, which is set by Iran under a different currency. So they want to have for a new marker. We've lost signal. We will be right back to this. But now let's listen from Panama. Tell me about this. Can you hear me? I do. Thank you. Thank you for waiting on the line. Now, there are some situations internally that are difficult to understand. In fact, there's a clear point, which is the tribal organization that has always existed in the country, and that for the East is very difficult to understand. Through the United Nations organization, their allies are trying to change the view of the country. This is part of the problem. Listen, what Colonel Muammar Gaddafi had a very acceptable plan in a thriving country, which was the tribal management of Libya. Libya is divided into tribes, into groups, ethnic groups that acknowledge the so-called Green Libya. The problem right now has been, after the coup of 2011, with the so-called Arab Spring, which took place in order to overthrow governments that were not following the needs of their states as Gaddafi's. So what happened was disaster. Disaster because each sector tried to pull their own way. And the self-proclaimed tribes that now consider themselves either the defeaters or the rebels of the war in Libya, every sector tried to pull this their own way. So we can see that the government of the National Union is supported by Italy and Haftar is supported by France. And opportunistically is also supported by the United States, who also have certain interest about this figure. So the problem is basically that they have not been able to understand what happens in Libya, and they left it in their own, facing a catastrophic war that has also brought death upon them. But the worst problem is that when all this happens, while Libyan citizens die in the war or are displaced to other countries, their natural resources are being stolen from them. So there's a problem here. They have not been able to understand the situation of Libya, and they've also kept aside the political force that was led by Gaddafi, that is still kept in certain parts of Gaddafi, certain parts of Libya for Gaddafi, and the son was the one to take over the transition and to follow the Green Revolution, but they have been kept aside. And this is something we need to consider, because this once again will be very dangerous for radical Islamism, which has been affected the Middle East and also Western countries. Now, there's something else that should be reviewed about this very, very carefully and with a lot of attention, which is the presence of the Islamic State. From the West, we consider this a great problem, not only from the self-proclaimed Islam State, but also in other areas of Al-Qaeda. How to understand this? How's this doing? And to understand whether it's not manipulation of one of sectors to go against it. We've previously mentioned what has happened in other countries, as Syria, where there are parallel groups that are financed by the West, as the White Helmets in Syria. But we also remember the militia who were sent to many places that were linked to Blackwater Company. A black company were armed men trained by the States, trained by Israel and their intelligence forces, invade the countries and lead to destabilization. So under these contexts we see the Islamic State. So they are just waiting for the result of the West, and their interest in the 70s and 80s of having a Soviet expansion. Now the same thing happens, but with other means and through other ways. And this is the source, the creation of the Islamic State. I don't know if it's falling out of control. This is part of the business of the Western states to give these people so much strength to lead to destabilization, to put the countries in debt and help them with the solution, but of course following their guidelines politically and economically. Yes, following the principles of the Western democracy with the imposition of this point of view that is not appropriate in many sectors. How important has this been internationally for those who don't understand the historical configuration of Libya? Well, democracy in the West, as we know, shows us what people do for the capital. So this is a way in the relationship between the empire of the nation, the countries who are not there with global imperialism. Their objective is to dominate them and to impose a democracy level where economics will take the effects that they want to have, dominate them economically with lie that they try to pretend to make of the democracy. There are people and places who are financed by the West, who are financed by the CIA, by Mossad, and by other groups who have the interest of taking the countries against imperialism into bankruptcy, as in the case of Venezuela, as it was previously mentioned, with a terrorist opposition, with the intention of destroying the achievements of Chavismo. The same thing happened with Libya, a project that is now taken to Venezuela, and all the Bolivarians need to take care. Thank you for your analysis. Good afternoon. Thank you, at your service. Thank you. Back with Miguel Jaimes, Professor. We're speaking about the importance of gas, not only because it's something that the powers of the world want to have and to contain it, but also the good things about the gas and oil in Libya. Yes, indeed, about gas. As I was mentioning previously, many countries like Kuwait, Qatar, Bolivia, and Venezuela have tried to foster the new marker, which is a new currency with the OPEC. So this is about the investments from North America. And the last decisions about Iran, which were not appropriate from Trump, shows the main markers rising. 5% of the American population, over 200 million vehicles around this area need great reserves of oil and gas. That's why there's a war. That's why Libya is part of the repertoire and is now the cradle of terrorism in the north of Africa, in Maghreb, and then it becomes a satellite to continue with the tensions to other countries in the region, the Persian Gulf, Iran, Iraq, and even go beyond with threats against Iran. Professor Jaimes, thank you very much for your analysis. Until next time, Tatiana, thank you very much. See you next time. Thank you. So now we continue with another break in critical moves in the Libyan movement today, and we come back. We're going to speak about something crucial in the table that we have in front of you. Who's who in this dispute? We'll be right back. Back. Russia, China, France, Italy, the United Kingdom, the United States, the United Arab Emirates take their position about the crisis in Libya, some trying to find a way for peace, while others want to continue with chaos. Let's take a look at this. Due to the geopolitical importance of Libya, the main powers of the region and the world have important interest. Even though it seems curious, the United States and Russia share, in this case, a dialogue with Marshal Khalifa Haftar, the White House, on the inside because they want chaos to continue, but Moscow because they want a stabilization in Libya, and that's why they speak to all possible political stakeholders. Some days ago, in a statement of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they mentioned that the situation of Libya was in grave lately, and they said, "We urge the both sides of Libya to abandon their attacks and to solve their controversies and sit down at the negotiation table." Putin's government, with over 10 nations of the Arab countries, agreed to continue trying to reach peace in Libya in the Russian-Arab Summit. Also, it is important to mention that the bombing against Tripoli that started on April 4th have been protagonized by French drones and also aircraft from the UAE. Thus, these countries are clearly supporting Khalifa against the government of Tripoli, acknowledged by the United Nations. According to information provided by WHO, the number of victims due to the battles that started on April 4th has already reached 121 deaths and over 500 wounded. Nevertheless, this number grows considerably by the day. A well-known protagonist of hostility in Libya is Marshal Khalifa Haftar, an important piece of politics and of the history of this African nation for over 4 decades. Let's remember who he is. Khalifa Haftar was born in 1943 in the western city of Lybia. He was military trained in the former Soviet Union before being one of the soldiers at the service of Muammar Gaddafi, whom he helped overthrow the king. After the coup, he became one of the commanders of the Libyan army. He was a supporter of secularism, and he followed the ideas of the former president of Egypt, Muhammad al-Nasser, a promoter of Arab socialism. In October 1973, he commanded Libyan troops that helped the Egyptian forces in the Yom Kippur War against Israel. For 1986, Haftar was promoted to colonel and led Gaddafi troops in the war against Chad. He was prisoner in one of the fights against Chad. Gaddafi abandoned but after being freed, he was evacuated to Syria, currently the DPR. With the help of the States, he aligned with the National Front for the Salvation of Libya, sponsored by the States, that had the goal to overthrow Gaddafi. He traveled from Africa to the United States, where he lived in Virginia, and it's believed that he created links with the CIA. He participated without success in an attack, a coup against Gaddafi that was not successful. After Gaddafi was overthrown, Gaddafi was taken out of power and killed, and then Haftar came back to Libya. Then Libya was also divided into 2 factions. Haftar took the side of the Chamber of Representatives and started the Operation Dignity, with the objective of killing extremists in Benghazi. In 2016, Haftar army was able to expel their opponents. As of today in this country, 2 branches of the power face each other. the legislative and the Chamber of Representatives. They meet in Tobruk, and the executive, acknowledged by the United Nations, that's in Tripoli, capital of the country. Even after Haftar traveled to France to meet with his opponents, the leader of the government of the National Agreement, Fayez Sarraj, there wasn't any progress with negotiations. On April 4th, Haftar, that currently has the rank of marshal in the Libyan army, ordered his forces to attack the capital. So, in this combat, as complex as the one in Libya, we are going to go into details with Winner Arteaga, a politologist, a professor, Venezuelan in the Bolivarian University of Venezuela. Professor, how are you? Let's start then. Who is Haftar? Because we know his history, but as of today, this is clear. Who are his allies and who are his enemies? Thank you. Haftar is the result of the United States of America, of the CIA, even after being trained in the Soviet Union. He is the man who the United States need to represent their interests in Libya. Why is there a contradiction in the United States government? One thing said by Pompeo and now something differently mentioned by Trump. This is the typical characterism of the cynicism of the positions of the governments of the USA about the conflict that they have led to and where they have been protagonists in the creation of these great wars that have taken place recently. And if we see the perspective of both Pompeo and Trump, we see that they follow a distraction so the international community continues believing that the United States continue to do what they want, which is being in power in the world. So with all this, they try to keep chaos in Libya. Indeed. The crisis in Libya will always benefit the United States, and the power in Libya will be held by the one who represents the interest of the United States. We understand that there are two great factions currently under dispute, the Government of National Agreement and Marshal Haftar, one through the consensus of the great powers of the West, while the other, as mentioned previously, has a greater incidence of the CIA and the American government. The Government of National Agreement was acknowledged previously, and they have been the ones who hold diplomatic relationships. They have a prime minister, and this has been under the instances of the United Nations organizations. So once again, the United States are not acknowledging the UN. Indeed, not only they're not acknowledging the UN, but this is another element for the United Nations to continue losing its legitimacy. We've seen that they don't have enough capacity to solve this type of conflicts, and that their perspective does not represent any obstacle for the unilateral policies of the American government and Donald Trump. This is extremely difficult to understand. That's why we have to go step by step. That's why we have to wonder what's happening with Russia and China. Russia had sought ways of dialogue through certain powers of the Gulf, through meetings, and also through the African Union with certain local actors that were important in order to help the situation unfold. And Russia has mentioned we need to look for the ways of peace. So now, what's the role of Russia? And who are they supporting? Evidently, based on the meetings that Haftar has held with the Russian government and with the governments of Egypt and France, even though he's shown his support to the government of the National Agreement, He's also provided his support to Haftar. The position of Russia will always be trying to get a peaceful solution, even though they acknowledge that there's no peaceful resolution to the Libyan conflict. This is what they say, of course. Everything becomes different and difficult, and now they're speaking about uncertainty. Yes, the Libyan people are always under uncertainty because they don't have any clear power that could unify all the nation. We understand that these are not the only two factions fighting for power, but also there are other groups, other militias, other tribes that with weapons and with economic capacity have been able to control great part of the Libyan territory. There are two factions that are completely different and meet in Benghazi. In 2011, all this situation started in Benghazi. There was an alleged robbery of the people, apparently inspired by the fact that had taken place during those years in African nations and nations of the Middle East. But then all of a sudden, we all realized that it was not the case, that this was but an excuse to start with the invasion. So once again, Benghazi comes to play. Indeed, there's an important point, and this is a strategic point for the development strategically of different factions, those who control or who have this territory under dispute, even though a great part of the oil industry is located there. That is extremely important when going to the Mediterranean Sea. It's also a piece of land that allows them to have a greater control. Finally, I have to ask you about Tripoli. So, we know what's going to happen, and we understand what's happening with the factions, and they were speaking and fighting for Benghazi. So what does Tripoli mean today? Tripoli, just like Benghazi, was another one of the great cities, the bigger ones with Gaddafi. And of course, having control of a city as big as Tripoli, that has borders with Algeria and also the Mediterranean, and also has an important point to be deployed. This will always be a point of ambition for anyone fighting for power in this nation. A struggle for power, a political struggle for power. But regardless of it being political, we see from afar that the solution of Libya could not be political and peaceful, even though the West have tried to show differently with this new wave of conflicts that are taking place. So much violence and the people suffer. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you. Now let's reach our conclusions. After Idris I was overthrown with the government of Gaddafi, Libya became an exemplary country for Africa and the Arab world because the leader of Libya unified his nation. The Green Revolution, as the movement started in this agrarian reform, fostered a system of social security, medical assistance, participation of the workers with the shares of the state, something never seen before in the country. He nationalized the oil industry to distribute the earnings due to crude oil being sold, and also to better the social agenda. Libya became the country in Africa with the highest per capita income in the country. Currently, they have different governments fighting for power, and is going towards a civil war. The armed conflict started in 2011 has killed thousands of people. Almost 1 million people have been displaced. The exports of crude have declined 90% and the country went down. The country is using mafias for traffic of people, and there are no possibilities for a peace agreement and elections to be held as is requested from nations in the West. So here we end our critical moves today. Until next time, continue with us.